Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So, today I'm going to make this fairly brief. I think I say that all the time, so I sound like a broken record, but um, violence in films. What I found interesting is I went to Philadelphia about a week ago, and I won't name names, but I spoke to someone. This is something I've been hearing a lot in the last few years. I would even venture to guess in the last 6, 7, maybe 8 years from people who see movies. And they say that violence in movies doesn't bother them. Violence against animals, a different story. There's also this misconception that violence against animals, that is, a dog that dies or is killed, or a cat that's killed, or whatever the case may be, that this is somehow a new thing, when in fact it's not. It's not a new shock tactic at all. In fact, it's, if you read any Stephen King novel, any Gothic novel, it's pretty much an expected occurrence that animals will be killed or sacrificed or whatever. I mean, when you deal with witches or the occult or that sort of thing, almost always it's factored in. Now, violence in films, when I hear somebody who's about my age, I'm 43 years old, so somebody older than myself saying that violence doesn't bother them, or when I heard from somebody much younger about a couple of years ago, which I thought was really strange to me, that this person liked horror films, and they said that they're not so much into comedies because they like to watch people die in a movie. Of course, not in reality. At least, I hope not. And with the popularity of Grand Theft Auto, which is not really being played only by kids, but actually by adults as well. Not me, but when you understand the appeal of Grand Theft Auto is the violence, killing people, killing prostitutes, the degenerates of society, that sort of thing. But when somebody says violence doesn't bother them in movies, um, I take issue with that, because violence is supposed to bother you. It's supposed to upset you. And in a film, films by Stanley Kubrick, Clockwork Orange for one, films by Martin Scorsese, Goodfellas, Casino, The Departed, Gangs of New York, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, all of these films deal with violence in a very realistic fashion. Now, aside from The Departed, I've not really heard people getting anything other than shocked by what they would see in his films, because it's real. It's not a joke. It's presented in a very raw, realistic fashion. Clockwork Orange is one of those films that even today it would never be broadcast on television. Well, what does that tell you? Maybe on cable, but not on regular network television. So there are directors who have dealt with violence in a very specific way. Roman Polanski, even directors from the past like Howard Hawks, usually very fast, clean, or I don't know if clean is the right word, but fast, in your face, a little short bursts of violence that were just enough to, get your attention, but presented realistically. Rio Bravo, a lot of westerns, The Searchers. Um, the point is that violence has, of course, always existed in cinema, but it should bother you when it's presented realistically, when it's meant to be harrowing, a horrific thing, drawn from real life. Now, there are a lot of movies that don't do this. You're not going to find realistic violence in a Marvel comic book movie. It's just not going to happen, or DC for that matter, or anything comic book related. And yet, many movies that are comic book related or seem to engage us in a comic book manner distance us from the violence, in the sense that it's cartoonish. If your favorite heroes are being thrown against walls, and this you see a lot of this, particularly in comic book movies, thrown against things and thrashed and fallen from great depths, there is nothing, there is no sting to that. There's nothing to take away from it except, that's exciting, but that's it. But it's not meant to be. But the films that are meant to provoke, well, we just don't hear about this kind of thing anymore. It's not a thing anymore. It was, and I've mentioned this in an earlier video about natural born killers, which was 20 years ago. It used to be that violence in films was an issue. It was a major bone of contention, particularly in 1990. There were a lot of films that were very violent. Even the films that were meant to be somewhat cartoonish and trivialize it a little. So 1990, for example, in the summer of 1990, we had Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was heavily criticized because of the violence. That same summer was another 48 Hours, which is a hell of a lot more violent than the original 48 Hours, but not as good. Um, and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, which came out, I think, around the same time that year. But that was a film that was certainly meant to be provocative, and it is. I mean, if you're going to see one serial killer film in your lifetime, that is the one to see. Anyway, the point is that it was a thing. People used to really decry violence in films. It's almost like, jokes about sex. Now they're much more graphic than ever, and it's on television. Somebody mentioned on The View that the Mindy Kaling show, which is a very good show, by the way, gets into specifics about female genitalia and that sort of thing that they wouldn't have gotten away with 10 years ago. But violence in films, no big deal. And violence on TV, especially, what you see in The Walking Dead, you would never have seen that on any major television network, let's say 10 years ago. Let's say even 15 years ago. Never seen that. And that's a violent show. But it gets a pass because it's just, zombies getting their heads blown apart, and that's okay. So I guess my point is that when films go a little deeper and a little more realistic, we don't see they're censored when they're shown on television, which is why a lot of them are just shown on cable. And of course, you can buy the DVD and you're going to get the full spectrum of things. But I guess the last film that faced some controversy was Django Unchained, but only in relation to the events, which was the Sandy Hook massacre, which was a horrific massacre, and that happened roughly a few weeks prior to Django Unchained, and yet there were other violent films around. Jack Reacher, for example, Tom Cruise, and so on and so forth, but Tarantino's film was the one attacked. And that was 2 years ago. But generally speaking, you don't hear people decrying violence. And so I guess my point is that perhaps we need to understand that even though we hear a lot about this in the news about violence, whether it's an ISIS terrorist group or shootings or whatever it is, we kind of, I guess at this point, many of us feel numb by it. But you shouldn't be. It's a very real thing. And in a film, you have the ability to communicate that to the audience. That taking a life is a very powerful act, and it really is. And we're missing that in cinema, I think. It's just taken for granted. And that's the unfortunate. So I guess next time you hear somebody say that, ask them, as I did, what do they think about certain kinds of films that dealt with violence, that is, towards humans primarily. Something really strong. And I brought up Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. You'll see that basically they're not so desensitized after all. Maybe the younger generation is and doesn't think much about this, but I think it should be an issue. Again, I'm not for censorship at all, but I do feel that we need to bring the power back of violence where it has sting, where it matters, where it's not a pretty sight, because it's not. It just isn't. And violence can incorporate anything. You pushing somebody, shoving somebody, punching somebody, kicking somebody, not necessarily just killing people. But any of that has to have much more um, merit in our society than it used to. It needs to be discussed because it's part of our nature, unfortunately, to, you know, kill. And it's a sin and it's an immoral act. It needs to be addressed as such, and we need films that really do that. So, that's all. Those are my 2 cents. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.